Greetings, my name is Rachel, and yesterday I had the wonderful opportunity to present about Greywater to Laramie Local Foods, and sadly the recording that I tried to get in that presentation was lost. I know there were a lot of people that wanted to be there, and so I've decided to make this vodcast. I am a professor at the University of Wyoming. I instruct in the microbiology program primarily. My job is sort of unique in that I'm called an academic professional where my job is primarily teaching, and I teach microbiology, medical microbiology, biochemistry, and the capstone microbiology course that centers around problem solving. That's the way that I came into connection with Laramie Local Foods through a project that we did with Acres Student Farm. I can be contacted really easily via email, and my email address you'll see up in the upper right-hand corner. So today I want to talk to you a little bit about Greywater, not only the environmental potential, which is by far the most important part of Greywater, but I also want to talk to you a little bit about the bacteriology, the microbial content of Greywater, and also the chemistry of Greywater. And of course, it's really important to think about the guidelines for use, how we go about safely using Greywater with putting in action all of the guidelines of the World Health Organization and for the state of Wyoming as well. So to begin with, we should define Greywater. Greywater is the untreated household wastewater from baths, showers, kitchens, hand washing basins, laundry. It's all non-toilet sources. So this is a picture of my Soup's Rad bathtub at home, and you can see that I've got some Greywater in the tub. This is post using the bathtub, and in case you're thinking, man, that is a cool bathtub, I wish we could talk a little bit more about bathwater. We're going to come back and talk about the bathwater and what I was able to do with that bathwater as a part of this project. But first, I want to differentiate Greywater from black water. Black water refers to that type of water that has been used as well, but it's been used as a toilet in the toilet. So it contains fecal material, larger amounts of fecal material and urine. So whereas Greywater might contain a little bit of those things, black water contains quite a lot more. Now, I hate the way that black water makes it sound like it's some sort of villainous sort of water, and in fact nothing could be further from the truth, because in fact the content of nutrients, of nitrogen, of fixed nitrogen that we find in black water can be extremely valuable as a fertilizer. So we want to talk about how Greywater, we're going to primarily be focusing in on Greywater and the uses for Greywater and the potential for Greywater, but don't forget that black water maybe has even more immense potential. There's just more in the way of treatment that we have to think about and safety when we think about black water versus Greywater. So for most of you, you're probably thinking about the use of Greywater maybe in your urban home or your rural home in the state of Wyoming. So we'll focus our coverage there, but not to the exclusion of thinking a little bit about black water. So let's talk about the potential, the environmental potential of Greywater. And if you ever just have a boring day and you want to read something super interesting, the World Health Organization has a publication that regards the use of Greywater, excreta, and black water, kind of thinking about the wastewater reuse. And it's a super interesting publication. It is about 130 pages though, so I'm going to try to give you some of the high points that come from that report. Maybe you didn't know it, but the average American uses something around the order of 100 to 200 liters per person per day. Whoa, wait, think that through. Hang on, 100 to 200 liters per person per day. I mean, I think I can think of some of those people that are on the 200 liter side of things. But if you think about that in US gallons, that's 52 US gallons per person per day. If you add that up over the course of a 365 day year, we can talk about that as being 19,000 gallons per year per person. If you think about a household, we might be talking about on the order of 50,000 gallons per person per year. So this can be the single largest way to save water. So when we think about countries that are facing water scarcity, which by the way, within about 45 years from now, the World Health Organization estimates that over 40% of the world's population will live in a country that is water insecure, that has water scarcity. That is huge. Think about that. Nearly half of the Earth's population will be faced with water scarcity. That's crazy scary, and this is a great way that we can think about trying to recycle and reuse water. So Greywater has a great impact potentially on water savings. It also has an impact on food, because when we think about the relationship between water and food, it is one that is very, very poignant. We can increase food security by utilizing gray water, also black water, to put onto large but also small-scale agricultural operations. And we're thinking on the small-scale side of things. Most of us maybe have a small garden. I have a garden that is mostly a flower garden, but I also have an herb garden. So could we reuse on a small scale some of the bath water and maybe basin water that we use in our sinks and whatnot? Now, gray water, the reason that I wanted you to ponder the ways in which black water was maybe a little better than gray water is that while gray water contains a small amount of nitrogen, it doesn't contain very much. Whereas because of the waste that is prevalent in black water, there's a higher nitrogen content. So we use like 130 trillion tons of fertilizer every year, and we could cut that down by a third by just utilizing black water sources. So the potential to add nutrients to the soil is really, really worth shouting about. Now, gray water has a little bit of that, and depending upon the detergents that you're using, it might have a large amount of phosphorus. There are phosphate detergents. So we may note that there are, in fact, certain things in gray water that not only are nutrients for plants, but also are fertilizers, as I said, fertilizers, insecticides as well. That is, there are also things in there that can be used as pesticides. So, when you think about the ways in which you try to get rid of insects on your plants, oftentimes you might spray a little bit of a soap type product. I use a little bit of Dr. Bronner's peppermint soap to get onto my plants when they're dealing with an insect pest problem. That's a good biodegradable way to deal with that. Well, think about it. In gray water, that soap residue is already there, so it may serve as an insecticide as well. Lastly, this is a really great way, the reuse of gray water is a great way to decrease the load on treatment systems. We have a phenomenal wastewater treatment plant here in Laramie. It's found on Banner Road as you're taking the Curtis Street exit onto I-80. And that they do a wonderful job of treating wastewater, but at this point we don't have regulations on the chemicals that enter back into the water chain after being wasted from our wastewater. And so there are many things, including endocrine disruptors, that are found in that wastewater and are not removed. On the flip side, if those are added into the soil as gray water, and reused gray water, in many cases there's potential for the soil particles to absorb certain of those chemicals and to therefore remove them from the water prior to that water entering back into the water chain. So this is actually a great idea with regards to chemical contaminants. So a lot of very convincing, I hope, evidence that utilizing gray water is a very, very good idea. And there are some resources in the way of the World Health Organization. Rhoda et al. Talk about the source that I am listing here, talk about the reuse of gray water in Africa and how they came up with regulations, but they do an excellent job of reviewing a lot of those regulations. And then Sybil Charvel works just south of the border at CSU, and she's done a great job with putting out resources as well for gray water use in Colorado. So you can check those out. So we're convinced, right? Gray water is totes rad, and we should definitely think about its potential to reuse, whether we're talking about plants that are for beauty, our flower gardens, or whether we're talking about small-scale agriculture. We can think about the possible use of gray water. Now, before we do that, we want to I always tell my students in lab, safety first, safety last, safety always. And that's never a bad way to err, is on the side of safety. So let's talk just a little bit about the microbial content of gray water. What kinds of bacteria might you find in wastewater or in gray water? And maybe a little bit about the characteristics of some of those bacteria. And of course, everybody wants to think about the pathogens because they're the Hollywood guys. They're the ones that cause these crazy enteric diseases, diarrheal diseases that make us shudder. And in fact, my poor little sister had to weather an infection with Campylobacter jejuni. This causes incredibly watery diarrhea. She was fortunate because she lives obviously in the developed world, and she was able to be put on an IV for 4 hours, and she was rehydrated with that supportive therapy. But in fact, 3.2% of all of the deaths annually worldwide are still caused by diarrhea. Now, albeit that's not the same as it was in 1904, where it was amongst the leading causes of death, but it's still very much of note, and we still need to think a lot about these enteric pathogens that cause diarrheal disease and make sure that they're not getting onto the food that we're watering with gray water. So some of these include, as I said, Campylobacter jejuni, Vibrio cholerae is another good example. I know you've heard of cholera, Salmonella typhi, typhoid fever, Shigella dysenteriae causes dysentery, but it also types of Shigella that can cause shigellosis, which is just an enteric distress, not something as severe as dysentery, but certainly something worth note. So these are just a few of the Hollywoodized pathogens that we might find in wastewater and in gray water. But here's what's interesting about some of these pathogens is that they are big wimps. They're very wimpy. They're not stable in water. They like to be in the host where the going is good. They don't do very well once they exit the host and are finding themselves in a water environment. And so for that very reason, they lack stability and likelihood of being present in high numbers at any given time in the wastewater that's leaving our home. Now, that doesn't mean that they're not there potentially to cause disease, however. So Campylobacter jejuni can cause disease symptoms even only 10 cells, if even only 10 cells are ingested. So therefore, we have to still think about the possibility of them being present in water and decide how we might address that issue. Now, one thing that is quite simple is that simply using drip irrigation instead of spraying aerosolized water that could contaminate humans and domestic animals in the area is one simple way of doing that. And in fact, simply using a drip irrigation that goes through a layer of filtration in the garden itself, so through some mulch and maybe sand, and it's quickly going to be pretty well removed. It turns out that the earth is the best filter. That is, it does a wonderful job of removing bacterial growth, microbial growth, through a natural filtration process. So that's something that can be done pretty simply with gray water. And then that gray water, of course, is giving the plants the nutrients and the water that they need, but is also being naturally filtered. And we'll talk about some of the guidelines for how you might restrict the amount of potential pathogen that might be there. Now, the truth is that most of these pathogens that are bacterial, that are enteric pathogens, they actually are so sensitive that they're not going to stay in the environment for very long. Partly, like say you've got a lettuce plant that you've watered with them, as long as the water's not allowed to pool on the lettuce and it's exposed to UV, then it is very likely that within very short order those pathogens will be dead. However, some of them are a little bit more, they're a little tougher. When the going gets tough, the tough get going. And that's when we start talking about parasites like Giardia. Maybe many of you have heard of Giardia, had an unfortunate backpacking incident with Giardia. It's capable of forming a cyst, and that makes it a little bit tougher. Viruses are also a little bit tougher. And you might know that in Australia, they've been using grey water for a lot longer now, and in a very efficient way. They've faced some water stress and are trying to regulate water use, and that's a really great thing, but it also means that they've run into some trouble with things like norovirus. There's a very recent publication about the presence of norovirus in that gray water. So these are some tough ones that sometimes can be a little bit harder. to remove. But interestingly, if you look at the CDC's report, if they are allowed to sit, particularly if the water is warmer, like even gets up to a high temperature, if you look at that water after 70 days, a majority of these pathogens are gone. Now, not all of them, and some of the data is confounding with some of them, but we can say for a fact that a majority of the pathogens in water are pretty wimpy. They're pretty wimpy. Now, that is compared to the good bacteria that are associated with our body. We have bacteria on our skin, in our mouth, throughout our gastrointestinal tract. In fact, these bacteria outnumber our cells by 10 to 100 to 1. They are incredibly important in our health. The human microbiome and the Human Microbiome Project is just beginning to elucidate all of the ways in which our normal florobacteria greatly affect our health every day. But it's of note that these normal florobacteria are also entering into the water chain. And so they actually are much tougher in many cases than the pathogens are. One type of normal florobacterium is E. coli. And in fact, we call E. coli an indicator organism because if our normal florobacteria are entering into a water source and they're present, then we can say, oh, there's a little bit of fecal matter present in this water, particularly if what we find is enteric, an enteric coliform or a fecal-associated coliform like E. coli. So we're going to talk more about them, I promise, but for now it's important to note that we can't, when we're looking to try to detect microbial life in water, it's very, very hard to look for and detect things like Campylobacter, Vibrio cholerae, Salmonella. These are not easy for us to find. It's like finding a needle in a haystack, and we have to have a very powerful advanced magnet to find that needle, and that means it's costly. It takes expertise, and so it can be, it's not pragmatic to search for pathogens in water, but instead what we do is we search for these indicator organisms, these coliforms, and their presence in the water in order to indicate that there's fecal material in the water. So we know that with black water, we expect to see fecal material in that water. With gray water, we maybe expect to see trace amounts of fecal material, and so maybe some coliforms in that water. So this being said, I want to segue for a moment to talk about the chemistry of water, gray water, before we then come back and say, well, how might we use this knowledge to help us in testing gray water to look for the presence of fecal indicator organisms, of coliforms, and maybe think about how that helps us understand gray water a little bit better and how you might want to handle your gray water before applying it to your gardens. So the chemistry is maybe quite common sense. We know that in gray water, and when you saw the picture of my bathtub in the earlier slide, you probably thought, oh, I wonder if she's got some, Epsom salts in there, and maybe she used a little bit of exfoliant, and what are some of the detergents, maybe some soaps that were used, and those are things that are entering into the water. Detergents are one of the big things that we find in water, and those can contribute both to salinity and to acidicity. Notice that with detergents, they have a unique structure. They have a polar head group, and that polar head group is charged. Generally, it associates with some sort of salt cation. So that's where we get the addition of a lot of salts, right? When we see the addition of detergents affecting the salinity. Also note that the detergents themselves, we put them in there for a reason, right? We like the fact that their polar head and their long non-polar tail, they form something called a micelle, where you get the polar heads and the long fatty tails all coming together, and it forms this structure where you have polar heads all on the outside and non-polar tails all on the inside, and that's called a micelle. And that micelle, you know what it does because you've all heard the commercial. Was it Dawn? Is it Dawn? That's like traps dirt and grease, and that's what they do. That's what micelles do. So we also know that entering into gray water are oil and grease. We can also recognize that some of the chemicals that enter into water may affect the pH. So we may see all of these things, hydrogen ion content, oil and grease. We may see changes in salinity and acidicity in gray water that might be different than what you get from your tap water. So there are many ways in which we might want to think about the quality of gray water and consider its quality and maybe do a few tests on gray water before we say, yeah, this is good to apply to our garden. Because of course what we can say is gray water should only be used if it is considered safe for the handler, does not decrease plant growth, does not cause environmental degradation. Of course, we want just the opposite. We want the use of gray water to be very supportive of increased environmental health, because we're not sending wastewater down the stream that contains a lot of these chemicals and that might be headed downstream to those downstream from us who use that as their source water. So we want to think about all of these things. As I said, pick up the World Health Organization's guidelines for safe use of wastewater excreta and gray water. This is volume 4, and I would definitely say this is a good read, but if you don't have time for that 130 pages of technical jargon, hopefully this gets you started just a little bit and thinking about safe use. Now, the other thing to bear in mind is that not only do we want to be thinking on a global level with gray water use, but we also want to be thinking on a local level. And we want to think about the state of Wyoming. So I had a great phone call and conversation with Seth Turney from the DEQ, and that's the Wyoming Department of Environmental Quality. And Seth was very awesome, and he provided me with a particular Wyoming gray water policy. And in that policy, there's a bit of verbiage, but get this, compared to, say, Washington's policy, which is 25 pages long, Wyoming's policy is only a page long. Now, also bear in mind that Seth did mention that this policy is currently under change, right? There's thought that this policy may be changing, and you should keep your eyes open for potential soon changes in the thoughts about how we regulate gray water. Right now, I'm just going to read to you from that policy to make sure that when you consider your use of gray water, you're fully following the guidelines for safe use given by Wyoming. So this is Chapter 3, Section 8, Permit by Rule Gray Water Added Policy 11.1. And I'm just going to read through this. Household wastewater, which has not been contaminated by toilet, right? It's not black water. Gray water includes wastewater from baths, showers, bathrooms, wash basins, right? Sometimes laundry, though that has some other issues, and sink water. So gray water reuse systems that match the following conditions will be permitted on a permit by rule system as described in Chapter 16 of the State of Wyoming water and wastewater rules. That is to say that no application for a permit or fee is required if you meet the following conditions. So you don't need to pay a fee and have an official permit. You just need to follow these conditions, but that's kind of what's considered the permit, right, is that you're following these conditions. So one, human contact with gray water will be minimal. And one thing that helps a lot with that is not aerosolizing it, but using some sort of intelligently designed drip irrigation. Water which has been used to wash diapers or anything that's been soiled with fecal matter shouldn't enter into the gray water. And that's just common sense, isn't it? You can rinse that out in the toilet, you know, if you've got baby diapers that you're trying to dispose of the fecal material. Gray water does not come into direct contact or adversely impact surface groundwater. We don't want mixing with that groundwater or potable water, right? We don't want the potable water system. It needs to be isolated from the gray water system. Potable means drinkable. Obviously, we want that to be isolated from the gray water. The potable, the gray water does not leave the property. You don't want to send it off to someone else. You leave it on your property and use it on your property. Water which contains hazardous material should not be used. Gray water sprayed into the air should not come into contact with any kind of humans or domestic animals. So maybe best not to spray it into the air if at all possible. So the application of gray water minimizes the pooling of water on the ground surfaces. We talked about that. Don't let it pool on your plants particularly and not really anywhere. If you've got your gray water in a holding tank, it needs to be covered and protected. We don't want mosquitoes getting in there. We don't want humans getting in there or animals getting in there. The volume of gray water produced doesn't exceed 2,000 gallons per day. And then also, in addition, at least one of the following conditions must be met. The gray water system has been constructed to allow diversion of the flow to the black water disposal system. So once it's, it's not entering, it's entering back into and safely being disposed in the same way that black water is being disposed of. Or B, the gray water system has been constructed to allow diversion of the flow back into a secondary gray water disposal system, so that it can then be secondary system shall be designed and operated in such a manner that extended freezing temperatures will not cause failure. And this is required when traditional black water disposal system is not present. So take a look at those, and if you need to email me, or you could probably also be in contact with the DEQ to make sure you fully understand those guidelines. So this being said, I was curious. I wanted to know, what about my bathtub water? Do I feel good about safely applying it to my garden? I've had this hollyhock plant that has some sort of insect problem. So it makes sense that maybe if I were to use this gray water to water that, that maybe that would add nutrients, water, and maybe a little bit of an insecticide. But the question is my gray water safe for use? So I wanted to do a little bit of checking. So I did a little bit of kitchen chemistry, where I took a bit of gray water that was straight from the bathtub that I showed you earlier, and I did some checking. I looked at total dissolved solutes. This is just a monitor that does measure total dissolved solutes in parts per million. This is a pH meter, so I measured pH, and then I took the water into the lab and I got jazzed and I measured coliform count. That is, I looked for the number of indicator organisms that would represent the presence of fecal matter in the bath water. Now, before we look at the results, it's important to say that this, as per the CDC's report, and as per common sense, coliforms are always overestimated in any kind of water source because these gray water sources are nutrient rich. And coliforms, unlike pathogens, are going to replicate and be present in large amounts in that wastewater, or excuse me, in that gray water after a period of time. So if you let that gray water sit, the coliforms are like, whoop, whoop, I'm gonna multiply, binary fission, yeah. And the pathogens are not. They're like, I hate this, and they're dying. So coliform count is actually overestimating what the fecal content of that gray water is. So that's a super important thing to bear in mind. Now let's take a look at the assays that I did in the lab, and that's me on the right there, doing 3 different assays: a presence-absent test, looking for the presence of coliforms, a multiple tube fermentation test, which is a statistical method to try to check for the presence of coliforms, and then lastly and most accurately, a membrane filtration test, which is a test where we send the water through a filter that has 0.45 microns. It stops bacteria in their tracks and holds them onto the filter, and then we grow it up on a medium to see if there are coliforms present. Let's begin by looking at the results that I got for the water chemistry. So thinking about the total dissolved solutes, which can be converted to electrical conductivity, which by the way was a nightmare because the conversion units go from parts per million to millisiemens per meter. Anyway, it's all in the, all in the calculation. So when we look at the guidelines for the electrical conductivity in the water, we want to see things of less than 40 millisiemens per meter. You'll notice that mine was a little bit above that, so that is, it had a little more turbidity, but that could be due to a lot of factors. I was using a bar soap that was pink pigmented. It was, maybe a little bit, caused a little more turbidity in the water. And so we're seeing just a slightly different part per million count there, but that's not very high, right? It's not that far out of what you would think of as just being easy to add to and use on your garden. The pH was 7.7, which was well within the suggested range of 6.5 to 8.4. So then you say, what about these fecal coliforms? What was the count of fecal coliforms coliforms. So this is where I got to the end of the week right before I was ready to do the presentation, and I had sort of some confounding data. Really, we want to see less than 1 coliform per 100 mils in our gray water before safely adding it into the soil, but I saw sort of some confounding things. My presence-absence test confirmed that there was at least 1 coliform present, and the multiple tube fermentation test said there may be as many as 1,100 or more coliforms present. That's a lot. But then the membrane filtration test failed to confirm any, because although there was growth on the filter, it didn't appear to be coliform growth. That is, it didn't appear to be very largely lactose fermenting. So I would need to redo this test and check it again. But I think there's a likelihood that some of what I was seeing there was an increased overestimate of coliforms, because I let the water sit for a while before I tested it, and I'm quite sure that the E. coli in that water was saying woohoo and was replicating. Now again, this wasn't confirming much in the presence of E. coli, so it's quite possible also that the coliforms that we were seeing there were not fecal in origin. So this is a good example of lab work, right? We don't always get the perfect answers the very first time we do something, but it does give us an idea for the kinds of things that you might want to look at when trying to determine if gray water is in good shape to be added to your yard. So let's just talk about methods that can be used to very quickly treat gray water before using it to water the lawn and or the garden. There are a few things that are great ideas. First off, if you want to take a look at some of the resources provided by Sybil Charvel, she again is at CSU and is very knowledgeable and has put out a whole web page that gives some ideas for use of gray water. So one of the things she says is, as I mentioned earlier, just a coarse filtration followed by a drip irrigation. This is generally enough to remove a majority of the bacterial contaminants. Now, it won't remove a lot of chemical contaminants, but remember, our chemistry looked pretty good. It didn't look like it needed to be remediated that much. The other thing that can be used in a Whittington Jones article in 2011, they talk about the making of a mulch tower, which is super easy. You just put mulch on the top and then gravel, and then you have this like screed surface that allows the water to exit from that filtration. And then that's a rough filtering apparatus that can be really, really effective. So there's another simple solution like this. It's used in Africa, and this is actually a set of slides that was free to be used for educational purposes. And you can see at the bottom that this comes from the Shua, and this is actually in Ethiopia. So they talk about how can you make a tower garden that actually does the filtration and then allows the vegetables to grow in the outer perimeter of the tower garden. So you can see here they've set out an area on the soil where they're drawing a circle that has about a diameter of 80 centimeters, and then they put in the sticks and then wrap the plastic around it, and then in the center, this is where the filtration is going to take place. So you can put buckets that have pores and will allow water to pass through and get filtered as it's entering into the soil in the periphery of the garden tower. So in this next image, you can see how it looks when it's fully filled with soil, and you pour the water into the center. The water gets filtered, and it just moves away from the center filtration apparatus into the outer soil, and it waters the plants that have then, little holes have been poked into the plastic surrounding the tower garden, and then the plants, in this case it looks like a lettuce, has been planted right in the side of the tower garden. So this is a very easy way to safely treat your gray water. Now, you wouldn't know for sure right until you checked the gray water coming out of the filtration what its chemistry was and what its microbiology was, but it is a great idea to think about simple treatment options for gray water. Marvelous. I have a lot of resources, and in fact that's really where the value of this presentation, I hope, comes, is in getting you connected with the resources that are available out there. One of my favorite articles was the Rhoda et al. Article, and it was pertaining to South Africa, but they brought in policies from very eclectic policies to talk about guidelines for safe use of gray water. The World Health Organization's website and their safe use guidelines were very, very important to my presentation. My personal communication with Seth Trinity and his relating to me the permit by rule of Greywater added. And then, of course, the Whittington Jones article regarding how you might make a mulch tower system. And if you're south of the border in Colorado, contacting or finding the resources that Sybil Charvel puts out might be a really great idea. Thank you for coming, and I hope that it was enjoyable and informative. Cool.